Welcome to Talking Tuesday. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today we're going to talk about, some of the struggles of being a quant. I've played with this idea in my mind for over a year or two now on how to actually address this. I figured I would talk about it more so in a podcast, not necessarily covering everything, but I originally thought I would label this as somewhat calling it Quant Disillusion. So the topic today is just focusing around what was expected of being a quant and what it's really like. And this isn't necessarily supposed to be a feel-good podcast where, we're all winners and I want to be a quant. This is more or less just looking at the mental struggles and kind of the career aspects of being a quant from my perspective. So what I'm telling you is not necessarily going to be what everybody experiences, but it's what I view and it's my perspective. So again, this is going to be more my opinion, my views and everything, but let's just talk a little bit about what I expected, and then we'll talk about the struggles, and we'll talk about the reality of it, a lot of it, and how it differs. And then I'll probably wrap it up on a higher note on the enjoyment and the fun of it a little bit, but I don't want it to take away from the seriousness of the conversation and a lot of the ignorance that goes around the industry as a whole. But let's just dive on in here. So what I expected was somewhat, I don't want to say it's from the movies, but a lot of what you see in the movies, a lot of the books you read, for example, on what it's like to be a quant, you have this image in your mind that you're going to work at a hedge fund, you're going to be this trader, you're more or less going to be like the wolf on Wall Street, but deep down that you're going to be the quant though, you're going to be doing more math and stats and but you're going to be this big shot and you're going to be making a bunch of money, you're going to be wealthy, which is awesome. You're going to be very successful, but you're going to be so in tune to the markets and you're just going to really enjoy it. And you're going to be living this awesome life. Typically, I viewed it like New York City, right? Living in my own place, maybe living in a high rise or something, maybe buying a house out in the country. I don't know, traveling in somewhat. But it was going to be this very respected and revered position. And I was going to be great and wonderful and successful. And I think a lot of this came from my business degree, in a sense that the business side really pumps your ego and you're great, you're brilliant, you're bright, right? You're the best of the best. You can do anything. And I even kind of cringed myself because one of my subscribers asked recently, and I've been working with them over the years, so we've built a relationship. They said, would you mind sharing your statement of purpose? And so I looked through them and I couldn't really find the one I got accepted from, which was a video one. But I found a written one I submitted to Columbia my first year, and I reread it, and it has a lot of important facts and characteristics of, telling a story, which is what you want your statement of purpose to do. So I shared it with him and said, hey, this is a good example. But I really cringed when I read it on how ignorant I was to the industry as a whole, because I had this delusion, which a lot of people have, that finance is a very important core aspect of being a quant in finance. And yes, that makes sense in some kind of ways and aspects, right? You need to understand finance and financial markets and products, but that's not really what's important. And the school that I actually wrote it for is Columbia, and I put 100% blame on me. It was a pretty terrible statement of purpose, and the fact that I didn't understand what I was getting into. I didn't understand the amount of mathematics and stats and computer science and the well-roundedness, which I don't think a lot of people quite understand from a quant perspective, that you need the well-roundedness to be a quant, right? You can't just be a mathematician or a statistician or a computer scientist. You don't want to be a single one-track, one-minded person. If you'd like to do that, there's complete industries dedicated to that. And so I wrote this statement of purpose, and I was just so embarrassed somewhat from reading it, and I thought about not sending it out. And then I thought, no, I will send it to him, right? It's definitely helpful. But it really kind of reminds me of my old mentality, the old business mentality. And I get really frustrated when business students message me all the time saying, Dimitri, I have a finance degree and I'm really smart and I know all this stuff and I want to be a quant, and I'm really quantitative. And for me, it's hard to accept that. But I'm glad I found the statement of purpose. I'm glad I've read it. I'm glad that I realized I was the business fool as much as anyone else. And you can't blame people for that, right? I don't blame myself. I don't blame anyone who messages me, right? I take the time to try to nicely write things out and provide guidance so that they don't make the same mistakes or pitfalls I made. But at the end of the day, you don't really understand what it's like to be a quant. You don't really understand the materials you need. And then when you go for the program here, right, I'm still on this mentality that it's going to be successful. It's very heavy in math and stats, and like they're the Einsteins of Wall Street. They're like gurus. They understand pricing. And somewhat, I think there's an expectation that you will learn how to price stocks correctly, and you will learn how to price derivatives correctly. And there's these equations that you learn because that's how they teach you in finance. And I think a lot of people, even on hard sciences like physics, for example, they think there's going to be this equation that you discover or you learn. And in reality, that's not how quantitative finance and markets work. There's no correct solution for it. There's more or less these guidelines on what is correct and not correct from a model development perspective, and then also tying it into what you're trying to model. So there's restrictions and things because, different assets, for example, stocks perform differently than derivatives, which perform differently than bonds, and, credit risk and credit markets and making loans. Like, everything has unique aspects, and selecting the model for that is important. So I had this very rosy picture in my mind. I feel like I didn't think I was going to be like a Bill Gates or anything. I didn't think I was like crazily like going to be rich, but I thought there would be this very, exciting, mentally thrilling environment, and I'd be surrounded by geniuses, right? I read Emmanuel Derman's book, My Life as a Quant, and I read quite a bit about, in that book, he talks about Bell Laboratories, and a lot of really smart people came out of it, and you read about Fisher Black and some of his interactions, and then I read on Fisher Black's book. I'm a big fan of Fisher Black, and I've learned more about him, and again, it seems like he's very motivated, he's very driven, he's very, very brilliant, and yet when you take a look at it now, like looking back on the book, you realize a lot of his life, I think, was somewhat lonely, because there's no one really around you that understands it. People are trying to make money and they want your ideas, and that's great. But I don't think you fully get the frustration, I think, from his perspective. And again, I'm speaking on his behalf because I don't really know. He's never really written about it. But I think there is a piece of him that I can relate with in trying to look and understand the industry and the frustration of people not understanding. And he was very, very articulate. So in the books that talk about him, he spent, iteration after iteration after iteration, writing and rewriting the same research papers or the same materials to get a very crystal clear view. And I understand where he's coming from. And I think for me, the struggle is similar, but again, it's not the same, right? I'm not Fisher Black. I don't know what his life was really like. But the more that I've gone through my career, the more I start to understand some of the pieces of the book, or interpret them at least, very differently than I originally did. And there's this very, very deep down struggle, I think, in many ways. And his struggle is very different from most because he had the academic versus industry kind of issue where it's like he's skating both worlds, and yet both worlds don't get along. And that's not the purpose of this podcast or video here, but there's definitely a really struggling part of being a quant. And this is where I want to talk about the reality of it. So, right, I've seen this rosy picture. You're going to make good money. You're really smart. You're working with brilliant people. It's very competitive. It's amazing. It's wonderful, right? I'm working really hard. Like, I'm deserving every dollar I earn. But when you start diving into the realities of it, the graduate studies portion was a little interesting because I think you need to study harder on the academics and the theory. So I hear a lot of students complain during their programs like, oh, I don't need theory. I want application, application, application. And then it's interesting to talk to my European counterparts and students and whatnot. And they're saying, Europe focuses very heavy on the theory, but we want more applied. And then from an American perspective, I think somewhat there might be too much of the applied, not enough of the theory. You need a balance, but I think a lot of students miss the fact that you're not going to learn like how to price a derivative and then go repeat steps, 1 to 10 over and over again. You need to think outside the box. You need to be someone who's creative. And even Emmanuel Derman has made some quote around we need less mathematics in quantitative finance and more creativity. I don't fully agree with the statement, but he has a very valid point. And I think part of that is people don't learn, they memorize. And so going through grad school is very challenging and grinding and difficult for me because I came from a very different background. And many of the students I saw go through the program and I talked to and I reached out to for help, a lot of their responses were around memorizing the material. And so I'd ask, why does this equation exist? And how did you get from here to here? and they would always come back to me and say, oh, Dimitri, it's really easy. I learned this in undergrad, or I learned this, wherever. And in China, whatever, we do all this stuff. We're really smart and it's great. But then when you would actually ask them for the theory, the construct, like why are we doing this and how do you get there? It would just be like, Dimitri, it's just this equation. And they just write it out. Or there'd just be a process, be very simple. And so I was very frustrated because a lot of these students are memorizing and memorizing. Yes, they're doing excellent on exams. And so deep down, I'm feeling like terrible, right? Because I'm not really prepared academically for a math, stats focused master's degree. And as many of you know, I transferred into an applied economics degree where, again, we focused on heavy amounts of math and stats. And then the electives I chose for the most part, again, we're lining up with the financial engineering curriculum and the math and stats and some finance from that as well, tying the program together, trying to really strengthen who I am. And I think part of this was good in the sense that I realized to be a real quant in my mind, right, that pre-expectation, I started realizing more I needed more math, more stats. Like that's what I needed a lot of. And so I focused a lot of my curriculum around the theoretical, rigorous materials that weren't necessarily applied. And I found a lot of the applied courses, while interesting and somewhat practical, a lot of times lacked enough rigor to really think outside of the box. And so when you went through the school, right, I felt worse and worse about myself in a lot of ways. And then when I transferred into the newer class, I started learning more and more and more. And I started focusing more on learning. I didn't care about the grades part of it, right? I just need to get the education. I want to do well in this. And on that flip side, right, there's other students that are excelling and getting, solid 4.0s, so perfect scores and everything, and they're doing amazing. When we graduated, I think that was probably about a year after graduation, that was the tipping point for me where I realized, like, even though my grades weren't stellar, and even though I wasn't, like, the top 1% or top 5% or the best student in the class, right, career-wise, I learned more, and I learned how to learn throughout my education, through high school, through my private schooling I went through was very, very beneficial. And then going through college, again, focusing on the learning aspect and not just memorizing equations and numbers and facts, but learning how the pieces fit together, learning how to implement them on new problems. And then going through grad school and realizing like the degree was too rushed, too much materials, too quickly, focused on the memorization a lot of times, not on the actual content and the rigor, and then switching over and really just focusing myself on the learning aspect. And as I'm mentioning here, right, a year after graduation, I'm looking back at all these students that were in my class, my original class that graduated, and most of them ended up with pretty terrible jobs. They might disagree, they might like where they're at, there's nothing wrong with that. But from a quant perspective, right, you went and you got a financial engineering master's, at least they did, and the vast majority of them did not end up in anything quantitative finance related. So they might be working in data, they might be working in marketing, they might be working in consulting, but it wasn't consulting quants. It wasn't really digging down into the quant realm where you would utilize your math, stats, and computer science. They were very single-focused, single-set jobs that did not require the master's. And so it's really disheartening when you look at it for a lot of students, right? And I try to put some reality into my videos where just because you have the degree doesn't mean anything, right? It opens doors and opportunities, but it doesn't guarantee you a good job. It doesn't guarantee you a good career. And part of this, I think, as being a good person and a good quant and a successful career and being happy is really focusing on you as a person. And I think learning, education, and academia all tie into that, as well as character, perseverance, and other personal characteristics in general that really tie into who you are as a person and drive you forward in a career to be at different levels. And so when I started the career and I started the first job, right, I was super nervous. I didn't know what to expect, right? I'm diving in. I interviewed with a bunch of PhDs, interviewed with a few managers who had MBAs. So I'm like, okay, like I'm a little comfortable with the managers, but working with these PhDs is going to be challenging, right? They're so much smarter than me. They know more than me. They have all this industry experience. And I started this job essentially not knowing anything. There's no training. There's nothing. You just have to dive in. Within the first 3 months, though, I really started picking things up quickly. And one of the big turning points for me was sitting in a meeting and just listening quietly, right? I'm a new employee. I don't really know what's going on. I'm nervous to say anything. I don't want to look stupid, right? I'm definitely not an expert. And yet one of the leads, or I guess directors, whatever, one of the big shots at the time, turned to me and said, Dimitri, you're not talking a lot. What do you think the problem is? We have, these problems with these time series models. We keep building over and over and over again. We think we have good results and it's not coming out. Like, what's your opinion? Just share with us your opinion. And I really appreciate him asking that question. It was definitely a massive shifting point in my career, a tipping point, I guess. And that I went from being scared and nervous to being like, wow, I'm probably far smarter and far better than I thought I was. I need to step out of my comfort zone more. But I responded to him and started explaining to him, based on the charts, based on the data, based on the redevelopment cycles. So again, not data related, but looking at all this, it looks like you're overfitting the models. So it's a simple statement. It's common in data science these days. People throw that out there all the time. But then he said, why? Why do you think that? And so I started going through just from my education and watching over, the last month or so, exactly why they were overfitting and how they were overfitting and how they could fix these solutions. Now, they took that to heart and they attempted to make some changes. They didn't actually fix it because they didn't they didn't know what they were doing for the most part. And that's a whole other story. But this was the point where over so many months after, I started realizing these PhDs and these experts had no clue what was really going on. A young guy like me with minimal experience and, a master's, a solid background, but not a PhD, was coming in here and diagnosing the problems right off the bat. I actually had the opportunity to build one of these models that was deemed a troubled model that no one wanted to do. It was thrown to me as essentially like, if you do good, you do good. If you don't, no one cares, it's not important. And then they told me to build like a model in Excel. My boss told me, do whatever you want, I don't really care. And then I built this rockstar model that came out and it beat all of their models in stability. It lasted longer than their models. It outperformed their models. It passed all the validations without any actual hard findings. Yes, I had some findings. Yes, I fixed them. I was a new developer. It's okay to make mistakes. You just got to learn from these mistakes. But I started realizing, I'm really smart, I'm brilliant, and my ego is starting to get bigger. And then I keep thinking okay, this is only one bank, this is only one environment. And then throughout the year, I started getting into somewhat confrontations with a lot of the development department. I was sitting in implementation, but I was crossing between implementation and development. And I started getting into confrontations with them about this isn't done correctly. And they were getting their feelings hurt. And so I started bringing in textbooks because nobody's listening to this young guy. And I'm like, look, right here in this textbook, it states X, Y, and Z. You must do this. This is a requirement, not an option. And then they would argue. And I'd bring papers in, academic papers. And I've continued throughout my entire career to do this because nobody wants to listen to you, regardless if you've been there for 3 months or 10 years or 50 years. It doesn't matter. There's a really big push against change in understanding quants at a very rigorous level. This is one of the disillusions. This is one of my big frustrations. And this is one of, I guess, the sticking points I've mentioned in past videos and podcasts here is the education gap. And when people don't know, right, you have to be very careful. You have to approach them like a wild animal, essentially, right? They might lunge out and attack you, right? It happens. They might run and hide. I mean, you don't really know what's going to happen. And so I try to approach people with the fact of, we could make some improvements, enhancements, but you need to do these things. And then I say, okay, I'll bring some documentation, some reports to read through them, but this is all the supporting evidence I have. You try to be very nice, right? Because I've been in situations where we've been in meetings and I've sat at a boardroom table and one of the developers that was the head, the lead, the project lead and everything of this was telling me something and I trying to nicely explain to her that this is not done correctly. And then what ends up happening is she gets upset, right? She's lashing out, that wild animal. And then they start raising their voice and they start kind of sitting up and they're not happy. They're upset that you're challenging them and how dare you challenge them. And this ego piece plays into all roles, not just the quant side, it's the business side, it's everybody in life. And so I raise my voice naturally, right? You raise your voice, I raise my voice. I'm raised in an Italian family, so when one person starts getting louder, if you want to get heard, you got to raise your voice. So I raised my voice to her and explained to her calmly, right? That is wrong. That is completely wrong. This is why, and I explained it. She was upset and didn't like it, and they kind of just shuffled it to the side. And later I brought in my textbook, which is one of the industry-leading textbooks, And I showed her boss and said, hey, look at, this and this and this. Please make the changes. They didn't make the changes. The model sucked and it failed, and that's a whole other story. But the point from this, I think, is that the more I move through my career, the more people I've worked with, I keep doubting myself constantly. Like, I want to be correct, so it's better to be conservative. But one of these big disillusions, right, from that beginning image was that everyone is really bright and brilliant and excellent. And yet when you end up in the industry, you start realizing there's not a lot of rocket scientists. There's not a lot of rock stars in the quant world, right? And if there are, which I've ran into a few of them, they do exist, they're quiet, they're conservative, they sit in the back, they build their models, they don't want to rock the boat typically, and I get it, right? I understand. Because an example of this, of it not working out well, is quants sometimes will step forward and then again you're attacked, right? Because how dare you challenge the way I do things, or I don't like that you're making more work for us. And so there's this conflict that consistently goes throughout a career, and you need to stand up a lot of times and fight for yourself. But a lot of these quants don't want to do that, and so they end up falling back and they're making poor decisions, or they just do the right thing and voice their opinions, but they don't want to rock the boat, and they kind of go with management. But we had a quant. I really enjoyed working with her. Nobody understood her. She was very brilliant, very, very focused on time series modeling. It's part of where I think I've grasped very important concepts from her and then ran with them. But nobody would work with her. She couldn't program very well, but she was brilliant when it came to time series, but she was difficult to work with. She even explained to me in one of our meetings about how financial engineers are dumb, they're incompetent, they know nothing, right? You need a PhD in econometrics to really understand this. And I took it, I accepted it, but I'm not going to fight her on it. I want to learn from her. I want to bridge the gap. And so learning that information from her was brilliant, and it helped me out a lot. But others in these banks and stuff fought her and didn't like her and were mean and nasty about it. And they wouldn't listen and they wouldn't learn. And I felt really bad for her. But at the same time, I think it's a struggle a lot of quants kind of face, is that when you do things statistically and mathematically, a lot of times it's very hard to explain them to people that don't have the background. And surprise, right? This is kind of the reveal here is, like I mentioned, the industry is not chock full of brilliant, excellent people. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I think focus changes. So you spend all your time in life focusing on academia, getting your master's or PhD, you get a career, and then you want to have a family and you want to have hobbies and you want to do other things. And I'm all for it. But a lot of us essentially switch gears, and so you're not as focused on it, and so you lack the sharpness, I think, that many top quants have. Also, a lot of them just give up from this battle that we fight. So I've seen this, and it's really sad. Guys that were fairly brilliant, girls that were fairly brilliant, they come in the industry, they're like gung-ho, they're on fire, they make it happen, and then after dealing with all this confrontation and fighting of senior management, of business side, of the quant side, of people not doing things, they essentially, I guess I would say, they just burn out and they just give up and they're done. And I get it, because the fight is no fun. It's not fun fighting people on this, and it's depressing a lot of times. And I think this is one of the aspects of being a quant that you don't realize is, if you execute at a high level, even after your degree, you need to continually keep learning. There's so much to learn. I'll die and not know, less than 1% of everything I wanted to know. But at the end of the day, a lot of times emotionally and mentally and even physically, you start feeling weak and depressed and anxious. And there gets to be a point where you just throw in the towel, right? It's not worth fighting anymore. It's not worth the battle that you have with people. It's not worth me yelling and screaming. And yes, I've had, unfortunately, a meeting or two where I've lost my temper and I'm yelling at some guy, just berating him about what an incompetent fool he is and how do you not understand these basic concepts, and him standing up and screaming back at me, right? The tensions get high. It's just not fun. And I think that's where a lot of people don't realize in the quant world that this is more or less the reality of it. And if you focus on the rigor in the academic portion, as well as the industry and application, it's hard to put the two together, but it's even harder to explain the two halves to the two groups of people and to do things at a very, very high level. And I think it's one reason you don't see a lot of top-notch quants. So I'm going to be the one that says it. Yes, we all strive to be quants. I even think I'm a quant. I strive to it. But I have defined it in the past, and people get upset when I define it, but I don't think it's something you ever reach. I'm not reaching, I'm not to some pinnacle and I'm some quant. I'm a lowly guy that's doing math and stats, and for me, quant is a process. As soon as I stop the process, as soon as I stop learning, I throw in the towel, I give up. For me, that's where the quant stops. And I think that's important to note because so many of us are going to have this fight and this battle, and a lot of times you have to pick and choose the stresses you endure. And so stepping back from the problems, working from home, for example, for me is like the best benefit. I don't think any of my managers have really understood why. Because something simple, I make a statement, you don't understand, I'm wrong, like all of a sudden, like there's no consideration or thought behind it. It's nice to be able to unwind on the other end of the phone or the conference call or the video chat or whatever and just stop and be like, it's okay. Okay? It's mentally okay. You have to let it go sometimes. It's 100% wrong. We're going to see losses all over the board on these models. It's not your money, and it's really terrible to have to think that way. But at the end of the day, a lot of the environment, a lot of the finance community is still built around being a business and making decisions because they make you feel good or because you've seen this in past experiences. It's not going to be based on academics and the correct statistical way to do things. And so you can almost guarantee, like, I could build models, or I can even predict which models will fail and about when they'll fail because they're so poorly built. And it's every bank, guys. It's not like one bank or one experience or one industry. Even if you look at other, I guess, people that are speaking out against the industry, I don't want to name any names because I don't necessarily agree with all their ideologies and how they've lined up and their criticisms. But there are books. Go look out there, top-selling finance books, all about how the industry doesn't do things correctly. They take too many assumptions. I guess I'll throw a few names out, but the Black Swan I'm not a big fan of. I don't believe in the concept of the theory within itself, but he does point to the overuse of normal distributions. And yes, some people, so not all firms are doing this, which I've pointed out in the past, there are people that are solely reliant on it and they don't even know it. They don't even understand it. It's mind-blowing, it's shocking. How do you work in this industry? Even people that are vastly experienced don't understand the assumptions behind their models, and this creates massive risks because many times those assumptions don't actually hold, and there are ways to get around them, but again, it requires more research, more education, more complicated processes, and again, there's nothing wrong with taking a simpler approach, understanding the weaknesses and accepting them as long as you monitor them. But anyways, there's that. There's another book, won't say the author, but it's on machine learning and finance, and he's again pointed out in many, many situations where things aren't being done correctly. And he's frustrated with it, and I completely agree. Like 100% agree on this. There are massive weaknesses. But back to being the quant, though, my expectations of what was going to happen and my expectations of what I do on a daily basis is very far apart. And the money part, so making all this money, being millionaires, I've done fairly well on compensation. I'm happy with where I'm at. I make more than enough money to finance and be who I want to be, to have my freedoms. No, I'm not making $1 million a year, and that's completely okay, right? I didn't really expect that either, so I'm fine with that, even though some will have that expectation. But the compensation's good, my benefits are good, my working from home is good. A lot of the people in the industry are very, very nice. And that makes the job far easier in many situations. I specifically like working in smaller teams. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, on the corporation side. I think it matters on the team size. When you find smaller teams, it makes it very fun and very exciting because you're so interconnected. Like, my teams are usually more or less like a family to me. Some of them might not know that. But we work so well together. And again, you come across colleagues that are brilliant, that you work well with, and you kind of share this struggle and this battle and this fight together, and it makes it worthwhile. I have colleagues I've worked with in the past, and I pick up my phone, which I don't have with me, and I text them, and I'm like, dude, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. These people are doing X, Y, and Z. I can't even believe how stupid this is. And then they message me back, and they console with me, like, I agree, that's ridiculous. How do they not know that? And then they message me back the same day or maybe some other time and say, this is what's happening. I can't even believe people have done this. This is 101 basics. And so I think the way you get through the dissatisfaction and the frustration a lot of times with a lot of this is that you have to build a community around you. I think this is important for every job. But from the quant perspective, the frustration, right? So my channel, for example, a lot of you know, I've made a lot of videos. I try to be very careful though, because imagine I go out there and I start saying everyone's dumb and incompetent and you're all fools and like this isn't done right and whatever. I'm not winning any favors, right? I'm not going to get anybody on my side to help fix the problem. And I think that's where you need to be careful on. So I mentioned rocking the boat a little bit, but don't tip the boat over, right? You need to be able to interact with people. You need to build relationships. My goal as an entire YouTube channel, and people continually ask me this, like somebody recently said, Dimitri, why are you even doing this, right? You're not making good amounts of money on it. It requires a lot of your time. And I'm like, I understand, but I don't like the industry and I don't like the way it's ran and I don't like the senior management industry-wide, right? I don't think they're doing the right thing. And a big shout out to Lloyd Blankfein. So the CEO of Goldman Sachs, I really liked the way he managed. I liked his personality. I think he led Goldman in a very good direction. But I don't see a lot of CEOs embracing the technology and the quants and the mindset of getting to the next level. And I don't see a lot of honesty with CEOs as well, which really frustrates me. But in general, I want to raise and educate and help people around me so that we as a team and as an industry and as quants can like slowly improve over time. And I really hope one of the big takeaways from my channel is I'm not doing this to make vast amounts of money. And I hope you guys will take the half hour to an hour to answer people's questions when you start getting up there. And we can kind of raise the industry slowly, piece by piece at a time, right? I don't think I can come in and crash the boards and like, I don't know, tell people the truth and write books and criticize everybody. And somehow they're going to look at it and go, you know what, Dimitri, you're right. Like that's a really good idea. We've been doing this all wrong. Let's just change overnight. I don't see it coming. And so that's why I'm trying to educate. I think education is the key to everything. I think this is where we can really raise the industry. We can reduce the frustrations. I mentioned in the past, I'll throw this in here. There's not a lot of quant training. There's not a lot of quant mentorship. Like I mentioned, a lot of quants get disheartened, I guess. I don't know if that's a word, but you lose your spark, you lose your motivation, and you kind of fall back to the corners. Other quants are so into the academics and the rigor. They're studying constantly. They're working constantly. It's what excites them. And so they're in the back corner doing their own thing. Like they don't really care. And so as a junior quant, baby quants, right? You're coming up. You're excited. You want to get in the industry. There's not a lot of people out there to help you. And it's not that they're bad people. It's not that the industry's bad. It's just that they're busy. They're focusing. They don't want to argue. They don't want to fight. They want to work on their own projects, their own hobbies. Maybe they have lives now. So now they're doing other things as well. And you don't see a lot of this camaraderie and mentorship. And I would like to see more of it. I would like to see people just to take a little bit of your time and answer questions, because it's really sad when I hear people say, Dimitri, I've emailed like 20 other quants and nobody's responded. Thank you for responding. I didn't know like X, Y, and Z. They don't even know I have a YouTube channel a lot of times, but they find me on LinkedIn and they message and they're happy and excited that I'm helping. And I think that's what needs to change in the industry a lot of times. And that's what needs to change with quants as well, right? We're not victims here at all. We are responsible for a lot of the problems. We need to work better with people to help bring the industry up. But before I'm on my soapbox here, the industry is just very different. I think that's one thing I want people to take away is you view it usually from the outset as very fun, exciting, successful, very rigorous, but you don't quite understand what it entails. And I think a lot of times when you get into the industry, so those that come from a business background don't realize it is far more stats, math driven, like a PhD in statistics or in math is far more useful because you're going to be working at that level. But then on the flip side of it, on the quant view, I think they view it as too much of, I'm going to be the world's best mathematician or the world's best statistician, but they fail to realize that you need to be well-rounded and be able to work with people. And so, again, the whole fancy quant branding and my channel and everything is trying to stand in the middle here where I'm not on a side, people are yelling at both sides at me, and trying to bring it all together, but trying to show you the realistic expectations here, right, of what it's like to be a quant. It can be a career nightmare. It can be personal hell. It grinds me a lot of times personally. I take it personally sometimes. The stupidity that goes on. Yes, people have verbally attacked me, upset, gone after me, on personal pieces of me, not necessarily career-wise. I understand the frustration on all sides. I try to take it more relaxed. I've been in the same situation. It's a doozy. But I wanted to highlight here kind of the pros, the cons, the issues, and just show here that it's not always fun. It's not always exciting. You're not going to be like always on the market cutting edge and like you're working and it's fun and thrilling. There's really tough mental times ahead. If you give up again and you just kind of go with the flow, that's a decision you make. But I think to stay in that quant mindset of continually learning and improving and also trying to help the business and work with people, it's a real doozy. So I'm just going to wrap this podcast up here. I appreciate everyone who's listening and watching and is part of this channel and part of essentially what I view as the fancy quant movement, right? So we'll mark it here on my shirt. For those of you on the podcast can't see, it says Quants Don't Quit. Again, that's part of my mentality. That's part of the branding. I think we can all move forward and learn, continually moving ahead with education and advancement and even the fancy side, right? So learning how to dress better, talk better, present better. So anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.